It is Thursday, May 21st, 2020. Good morning, I'm Pastor Thor Ramsey with Center Church, and this is Gospel for Five, where we take 5 minutes out of our day and focus on the gospel and the one who saved our souls. In God's economy, good things come from bad things. Light shines in darkness. Receiving comes from giving. Gaining comes from losing. Living comes from dying. Yesterday, Psalm 105 reminded us of how God worked in Joseph's life. Now the psalmist turns our attention to Moses. And speaking of the Egyptians, he writes that God, in verse 25, turned their hearts to hate his people. Again, we focused on this idea that God is sovereign over all things. We didn't use that language yet, but that's the idea. God is sovereign over all things. And it's not just that he's sovereign over all things, but he orchestrates things. We would argue the scriptures teach us that God orchestrates all things after the counsel of his good pleasure, after the counsel of his own will. And he turned, God, it says he turned. If you read through this segment, as we're doing right now, I'll continually point this out. He turned their hearts to hate his people. God did this to deal craftily with his servants. He sent Moses, so God turned their hearts. God sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They performed his signs among the people, among them, and miracles in the land. So they performed the signs, but whose signs were? They were God's signs. God sent darkness, made the land dark. They did not rebel against his words. He turned their waters into blood and caused their fish to die. Again, God's sovereign over all things. God is the one bringing about all these circumstances. Their land swarmed with frogs, even the chambers of their kings. He spoke. God spoke. And what happened? Circumstances changed. He spoke, and there came swarms of flies and gnats throughout their country. He gave them hail for rain and fiery lightning bolts through their land. He struck down their vines and fig trees and shattered the trees of their country. He spoke, and the locusts came. So again, there's this idea that God creates by his mere command. And that would apply to our lives. God can speak, and circumstances of your life will change like that. God will speak, your life will change. The circumstances of your life will change. Now, they could change for the better, they could change. It just depends on what God's purposes are. Now, in this case, God's dealing with a stubborn, rebellious people. So there's a sign. Stay away from that aspect of life, right? Okay? And says, so the devoured, and verse 36, he struck down all the firstborn in their land, their first fruits of all their strength. This is devastating. The wages of sin is death. Then he brought out Israel with silver and gold. Now here's God dealing with his people, dealing with those who place their trust in him, those who love God with all their heart, soul, strength, and mind, their neighbor as themselves. And there was none among his tribes who stumbled. Egypt was glad when they departed, and the dread of them had fallen upon it, upon the whole land of Egypt. So he spread a cloud for a covering and fire to give light by night. Now, again, we could go on and on with this psalm and God dealing with his people, but the emphasis today, the thing I will emphasize today is God turned their hearts. God sent Moses. God sent darkness. God turned the waters. God spoke and things changed. God gave them hail. God struck down. God spoke. Things changed. God struck down. And God brought out his people with silver and gold. Now, this whole psalm is dealing with this whole age. It's really telling an overview of the story of God's people. Remembering that God from one person spoke one word to Abraham, from you will come. There's the promise of faith. We believe that same promise now that God spoke to Abraham. We have faith in what God has said, but we have faith in what God has done, and we have faith in what God said his actions meant in history, that it is by the blood of Jesus Christ we are invited in before his throne room to petition him as his children, to be cared for him, to eat at his table, to eat at the table of the King of the universe. We believe him because all throughout history he's proven himself faithful. He brought out Israel with silver and gold. There is cause for us to rejoice today because we are his. And what has God said to you today? And what are you going to do about it?